Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm Ollie Henman. I'm the coordinator of Action for Sustainable Development, and I'm really excited to be able to introduce this session today at the SDG Action Zone, which is all about stories from the front line of community activism. I think it's no surprise that 2020 is turning into a critical turning point for the world. The COVID-19 pandemic has shone a glaring spotlight on the intersecting challenges that we see of social, economic, and climate emergencies. And the inequalities that have been growing over recent years are now bubbling up and leading to major challenges for communities that are most often left behind. That's why back in May, over 800 organizations, together with us, came together to call for a more just and sustainable way out of this current pandemic. And now we're saying in September, it's time to turn it around. We need to see real change towards that more just and sustainable future. But we also want to highlight that it's really down to communities themselves. And we will hear today from diverse voices around the challenges that people are facing all around the world, and also how they themselves are finding practical action, building community resilience, building a way forward that will work for those communities who are most often left behind. So this is a session that both will consider the challenges that we face in many parts of the world, but will also often offer solutions. So I'd like to start by inviting a youth activist who I met and had the great pleasure to meet in Zimbabwe, who's the national coordinator of the African Youth Initiative on Climate Change, and that's Jean-Betrand Mhandu. So Jean-Betrand, over to you. I'd love to hear your insights onto the challenges that you're facing.
Thank you, Ollie. Just like Ollie said, my name is Jean-Betrand Mhandu. I'm the National Coordinator for African Youth Initiative on Climate Change. I also work with Earth Day Network. So as young people, currently the main challenges that we are facing is the ability to adapt and understand the challenges that we are facing, posed by climate change. Climate change poses several variabilities that we studied, of course, in geography, but never had been experienced before. So that uncertainty itself is sort of like a shocking background to all of us as young people at national level. We need us as young people to understand what problems we are facing, and we can, come up with possible solutions. For instance, if it's in terms of flooding, we recently had a problem, a challenge that we faced in Zimbabwe as grown. That you guys might have heard, called Cyclone Idai. And lots of people died, mudslides, but we did not know how to prepare ourselves of such a challenge or such a problem. So these are some of the problems that we are facing. Our food crops, they are being affected by, pests. They are being affected by scarcity, water scarcity. Our produce is reduced, yet we depend more on agriculture as a nation as well as communities. So these are some of the challenges that we are facing. And in terms of just transition, most of us have been going to school, just to make money, go find a job, make money and grow up. But then we are failing now to cope with the new reality where we have to produce for our communities. Most of the staff rely on us. We have to build synergies, build resilience within our communities, and find best ways we can produce at the same time. So, and also put to bed all the education that we have been acquiring over the years, all these degrees. Some of them, they are irrelevant now. For instance, if you are studying how to mine coal, how are you going to get rid of that degree? And, as we try to put on these solutions now of adaptation and reducing our emissions, we have existing systems that we have, such as, the bureaucracy that is there. It's really a put off the issue of resources. We, as young people, we tend to have less ears that pay attention to our ambitious ideas as they are seen unrealistic. So these are some of the challenges that we are faced with. We have political instability, unwillingness for us, to participate and be on top of this change. So these are some of the challenges that we are facing, as well as the fact that everybody is asking for innovations, whereas we are not given the time to think what innovations are relevant and nobody is sacrificing to lose some resources in trial to those things. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Perfect timing within your 3 minutes. So that was ideal. Our next speaker is Memory Kachambwa, and she is the Executive Director of Femnet, the African Women's Development and Communications Network, with more than 18 years experience. Memory, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ollie. So and thank you so much for allowing us to speak in this platform. So one of the key challenges that most women leaders in the front lines are facing is the lack of recognition and attribution of their work, particularly right now in this COVID pandemic. We have seen that most of the women human rights defenders, particularly in informal settings or in different settings, are not being recognized for the work that they are doing. When we see some of the COVID response plans, there is no inclusion of a diversity and representation, particularly of women who are at the forefront. So you find most of the discussions exclude the women who are at the forefront in many of the communities. And this is such a big, big challenge, because the lack of their recognition means that they are not part of the agenda, particularly in terms of providing the solutions and what really matters to them. We've also seen a lot of challenges around the politics around the funding, where there isn't much paradigm shift in terms of really addressing systematic and structural challenges. So most of it is, most of the responses are humanitarian in nature, and even some of the humanitarian responses, they are not cognizant of giving dignity that is required. So you find, of course, there could be food packs here and there, but in some instances, if asked, women want to have cash, which will allow them to have the agency to do what they want to do. We have seen an increased numbers of sexual gender-based violence, particularly with the different lockdown situations. We know that the first responders to issues on sexual gender-based violence are mostly women leaders who have no resources in most instances, and the states have not invested in making sure that there's social protection and that they're actually able to respond to most of the cases that women face. There's also been a lot of restriction of movement, and this has affected women differently. So there's a tendency for some, when you look at most of the responses, is that for frontline workers to address, in our context, women as homogeneous, yet they are different diversities, and there are also different intersections. So the way women with disability, for example, experience some of the challenges is completely different from other groups of women. So I think a lot of challenges have come forth in terms of women at the front line, in terms of them getting the support that is required, them also having access to some of the platforms, particularly the digital platforms. You'll find there's a huge divide. Not all women are able to access some of these platforms and able to speak out, even though we do know these platforms have also been able to cut some of the barriers in terms of the hierarchy also of power, but there's still a huge digital divide, and that is such a big challenge, among others. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Memory. And it feels that there's much more there that could be said. And I'm sorry we don't have more time, but we're already seeing some trends from both Jean-Betrand and Memory in terms of the lack of real investment that is so critically needed. So next we'll come to Beena Pallical, who's a Dalit women's leader from India and is the General Secretary for Economic and Educational Rights within the National Campaign on Dalit Human Rights in India. Beena, over to you.
Thanks, Ollie. Thank you for this opportunity. I'm going to speak specifically on the community called Dalits, in India, which is, if you must have heard of the caste system, where outside of the caste system lie a community called Dalits, who are the former untouchables. And because of this caste system, there has been several exclusionary practices that have been there. Over the years, we've seen that one of the most important things, I think memory also highlighted, is the systemic and systematic exclusion that takes place and continues to do so. Everybody knows about this. Everybody is aware of the fact that caste plays such a significant role in marginalizing communities like the Dalits. However, there is a certain invisibilization of the Dalit, and it's also called communities discriminated based on work and descent, DWD communities as well. This invisibilization happens because more and more access to resources, access to entitlements, access to legal aid is oftentimes very difficult for Dalits as a community. Furthermore, for Dalit women, because the intersectionality of caste, class, and gender just makes it that much more difficult for a Dalit woman to access these rights. If you look at over the years, what we have seen, the increase in violence or the increase in atrocities on Dalits by other communities that are non-Dalits is about 40,000 cases of violence and atrocities every year, which is a huge number of cases. Out of this, I think of 5,000 odd women. So they say every day, if you calculate the data, if you look at the data and break it down, every day there are about 8 to 9 Dalit women who are raped on a daily basis, if you break down the numbers. So this access to justice also becomes difficult for a Dalit woman who has gone through a violent, some kind of violence, atrocities, can't even go to the police station to register a first information report because they don't want to register cases. And she's further demeaned, saying that, it is your fault that you've been raped, or it's your fault that an atrocity has been committed. This has been a pattern that we've been seeing. During the period of COVID, what we've seen is COVID has just exposed a rotten system that is already there. It has already exposed the exclusionary and the inequalities that exist within the system. COVID has brought it out. During COVID, we have seen that it was only the Dalits who were the cleaners, who were the manual scavenging, people engaged in manual scavenging, or people engaged in cleaning the gutters, still working during the COVID period without any protective gear or without any kind of, in terms of protecting themselves. So we see that this kind of an exclusion continues during COVID. All of you must have seen on our television screens or in newspapers of how people have migrated from the villages to the towns for jobs, were suddenly left without jobs because of the lockdown due to COVID, and had to walk back home. And these migrants also, mostly they're from the Dalit and the indigenous communities. So most of them are now without a livelihood, without access to any public entitlements, without access to legal aid or access to justice. This is just multiplies the impact of COVID-19 on the communities.
Thank you, Beena, and again, incredibly strong, the points you've highlighted, and again, as you say, the direct violence that people are experiencing is really quite shocking, and this is something I'm sure that will come out in the further discussions. I'd like to keep us moving, I'm afraid, just because of the time, and move now to Fatou Jeng, who is the founder of Clean Earth Gambia, and is also a very well-known youth activist on the environmental side, and recently was one of 20 youth activists who wrote an open letter to the G20 finance ministers demanding climate action. Fatou, over to you.
Thank you very much, Oli, for having me here. I believe my co-panelists have mentioned very crucial issues, not only about the environment, but other social vices that are actually happening around. But I'll focus more on the climate challenges that we continue to face, especially in the Gambia here, because already we have been seeing the devastating impacts of climate change, not only when it comes to sea level rise, deforestation, and drought, but it's rather sad to see that people have been actually losing their lives and their livelihoods due to the impact of climate change. For example, in the Gambia here, many people actually depend on agriculture for their source of income and for their source of feeding. But with the recent increase in drought, it has been really affecting people a lot because it remains a major hazard in the country, with about 30% drop in annual rainfall within the last 30 years. In addition, as well, experts have also mentioned that the capital city of the Gambia will inundate under a 1 meter sea level rise due to the impact of climate change. So these are some of the few major issues that we're facing. And recently, we've also been seeing mass flooding across the western part of the continent. For example, in Niger, in Burkina Faso, among others, we have seen over 330,000 people actually being affected by the mass flooding as well. So I believe these are issues that has really been a concern for us as young activists. That is why we have been trying as much as possible to not only engage in activities that are going to create awareness about the growing climate problems, but to also see how we can also make sure that people are more responsible in terms of their actions and their attitudes. Also in the Gambia here, we have been also facing issues with illegal rosewood harvesting, because recently a report has been released from the environmental investigation agency that the Gambia and Senegal has actually imported over 1.6 million rosewood trees from 2012 to 2020 to the Chinese. So even though we have been trying as much as possible to engage our authorities to make sure that this is totally stopped, because from the report we've also seen that some of our officials were actually engaged in this process for monetary gain. In addition, we have also seen how we have been selling our natural resources, especially our fishes, to other countries. And we understand that in the Gambia here, people don't have much money to be able to feed themselves. So what we do is we depend on our natural resources, such as our forests and our agricultural activities, to be able to feed ourselves. So also we have been also facing issues when it comes to fishing, because we had partnership with other countries, and this has really been affecting a lot of people. And our fish is actually very expensive as compared to how it used to be. And we've also been experiencing severe deforestation as far as our environment is concerned. So these are things and many other ill social vices aside from the climate activities that we have been facing. That is also with the inadequate participation of women in politics and decision-making processes. And we all understand that women actually contribute the least to climate change, but they are the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So we've been trying as much as possible as young female climate activists to make sure that we engage our government to have more women representation in decision-making processes concerning our environment. So these are issues that we're actually facing, and I'm hoping that as we go further into the discussion, I can be able to buttress more on some of the things that we're doing in making sure that we mitigate the environmental crisis that we're facing.
Thank you, Fatou. And again, some very, very clear analysis there. And it's interesting how you're already making the link across in terms of the impact from sea level rise. And I think that will be a direct link now as we hear from another strong youth activist based in the Pacific Islands, Josaia Jirauni, who has been working both as a volunteer in response to the COVID pandemic, but also with PIANGO, the Pacific Island Association of NGOs, working across a number of islands, looking at communities that are being displaced due to climate change. So, Josaia, over to you.
Thank you, Oli. First of all, climate change poses an existential threat in the Pacific, and some of the most vulnerable are the atoll states. So PIANGO, in partnership with its member organization in Kiribati, it's called the Kiribati Association of NGOs, are currently implementing a project called the Kiribati Voices for Dignity and Resilience. This project is supported by the Commonwealth Foundation and focuses on ensuring that Kiribati communities are safeguarded from climate-induced displacement, ensuring their safety, security, and dignity in adaptation and resilience. For us, in terms of the project, we are actually looking at the internal relocation in Kiribati. If you are aware, the Kiribati people, though they might be vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, they are very resilient. And this is testament in their resolve that they will stay in Kiribati and will adapt to the impacts of climate change. They will never leave Kiribati to relocate or migrate somewhere else. So within that ambit of staying in Kiribati, that resolve to stay in Kiribati, this is couched in our own ties to our land, our cultural identity. For many Pacific Islanders, the place that we are born, where umbilical cords are actually buried, that is where we are. That ties to our land. When we have obligations to our land and to the broader community. So in terms of the challenges, the impacts of climate change is actually also a challenge, which in terms of our ties to our land. How do we mitigate the impacts of climate change within our identity? If we have to relocate, are we losing some of our identity? That's one of the major questions that we are actually facing the Pacific Islands and in Kiribati in that aspect. I'd also like to say that in Kiribati, there have been relocation within each island, within internally. So the communities are relocating to their own land. And this is due to the coastal erosion, the saltwater inundation that are happening. And sometimes the saltwater inundation might seep into the water sources and at times contaminating the water sources of the communities. So this is a major hazard or a threat to the communities in Kiribati. Secondly, the impacts of climate change on their livelihood, and in particularly the food security aspect due to coastal erosion or saltwater inundation. As the soil becomes salty, you cannot grow a lot of food. So those are some of the apart from those challenges, given the fact that many of our countries, especially for the atoll states, they are reliant on their budget. Their budget is reinforced by aid. Due to their small economies, there is still lack of resources to support the adaptation and mitigation plans, not only of our governments in the various atolls, but for the communities themselves that are vulnerable. I think I will leave the rest to the discussions only. That's just briefly some of the challenges. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Josaia. That's a very comprehensive overview. And again, I think this already ties in nicely now to our final speaker in terms of the connection with the land and the real challenges that people are facing with climate displacement. Our final speaker is Angela Menges. Angela Mendes is the daughter of Chico Menges, who was a great climate activist in the 1980s, who was actually assassinated. Angela has recently re-established the Alliance of the Peoples of the Forest, together with a number of other organizations in the Amazon region in Brazil. And she leads the Chico Menges Committee that carries on the work that Chico Menges started in the 1980s. Angela Menges, over to you.
Obrigada, Oliver. Sou Angela Mendes, coordenadora do Comitê Chico Mendes, e para mim é um orgulho imenso estar aqui nesse espaço que também acolheu as ideias e a luta do meu pai em defesa da Amazônia e das populações tradicionais, né? Ele concedeu o Global 500. Saudações também aos demais painelistas. Pois é, nós brasileiros e brasileiras, a gente está muito assustado com a situação do nosso país e também da Amazônia. Esse bioma composto pela maior floresta tropical e pela maior biodiversidade do mundo, que guarda aí 20% de toda a água doce disponível no planeta, que tem uma potência, uma riqueza socioambiental muito grande a partir dos seus 180 povos indígenas, e as outras populações tradicionais também, que juntos ajudam a proteger cerca de 20% da Amazônia, que também é um bioma que também presta um serviço ecossistêmico extremamente importante, né, através da regulação e do equilíbrio climático. Então, a gente está falando aí de um bioma potente, né, mas que está ameaçado, né, ultimamente. A Amazônia perdeu 20% do seu território para a produção de commodities, principalmente, né, carne e soja. E segundo os dados do Instituto Nacional de Pesquisas Espaciais, o aumento no desmatamento da Amazônia de 2018 para 2019 foi de 29,5%. E de 2019 para cá, de mais de 34%. Né? Isso é um aumento muito significativo no desmatamento, mas que também traz um aumento, gera um aumento muito grande na queimada, nas queimadas. Hoje, na Amazônia, nós estamos vivendo esse período de intensas queimadas. É o período que as pessoas mais adoecem com problemas respiratórios, né? Isso agrava muito a situação dos povos da floresta que já estão lá em seus territórios doentes, né, contaminados e morrendo. Na verdade, as populações indígenas, principalmente, têm perdido, nesse período, suas lideranças, suas referências, a sua memória viva, e por que não dizer a memória viva, né, do nosso país também. Então, é uma situação grave que a gente está vivendo, isso potencializada muito pela ausência do Estado, né, que se por um lado, e de um governo que, se por um lado nega a gravidade desse cenário, nega a gravidade dessa pandemia, nega também o atendimento a essas populações, mas, por um lado, age no desmonte do nosso sistema e da nossa legislação ambiental, né? Muito apoiado aí também pelo legislativo brasileiro, o sistema legislativo brasileiro, que tem também dirigido uma série de projetos ao parlamento que ameaçam a integridade desses territórios, né?
Muito obrigado, Ângela. Estamos com pouco tempo, infelizmente, mas a gente volta novamente para você. Thank you so much, Angela. That was extremely useful in terms of understanding the scale of the challenge in the Amazon and the increase in devastation. And we'll come back to you in the second round again as well. So now, coming to the second round, we'd like to think about what are some of the ways forward. How do we as civil society find a solution? What are some of the steps that you're already taking within your own areas? So I'd like to come back round to each of the panelists again. So starting again with Jean-Betrand, back to you.
Yeah, so in the civil society space, me and some of the volunteers and colleagues that I work with, some of the things that we have thought or seen very imperative is firstly to raise awareness, inform the standard or just a basic civil society person to be informed and understand what challenges they face, what climate change is, because at local level, it's very difficult to communicate since it's presented in a scientific or in a foreign language, which is English more normally. But then to disintegrate the information so that a basic user, somebody in the rural areas, understand what climate change is and what the giant that they're dealing with is. So that is one of the key issues that we are working on. So we would want to raise more resources so that we expand. Right now, we are working with the government to develop what we call a climate learning strategy together with UNITA. These are some that we are working in and updated and mainstream it in different aspects and platforms that participate very highly in decision-making processes, that's advocating for youth inclusion and be the reins holders for all the decisions that are going to be made, try to influence them so that they impact positively on our communities. The few that are informed, and we're working on setting up some practical examples, exchange programs, setting up some litter transfer centers in a community so that the community can also know what it is to separate waste, what it is to take care of, to start implementing projects like fish fire as an example, as a food resilient program, or as a project that also, capacitate their community into food crises, grow small grain crops as a climate smart agriculture initiative. So those are some of the exemplary projects that we are working on. And we're also working on raising resources that we can also give to other youth groups that we work with, motivate them, incentivize them so that they start restoring, planting trees within their communities, making sure that they protect it. Also inform them in terms of social accountability so that we don't get huge companies such as mining companies coming to distract their resources and stuff like that, and also hold accountable the duty bearers within their particular communities. So those are some of the programs that we are working on and would probably wish to get more investment to strengthen these groups.
Thanks so much, Jean-Betrand. That's extremely useful. And I think you've highlighted there the ways that some of the resourcing can really make a difference at the community level. And we need to see how we can really get more of the resourcing to the kinds of projects that you've just described. So we look forward to working with you more in the future. Coming on to memory now, you have worked with so many different communities, memory, in different parts of Africa. How would you see, what are some of the good examples that you've seen of how people are moving things forward in their own situation?
Yeah, so thanks, Oli. So I think we've seen a lot of resilience around particularly women's groups coming together, offering renewed solidarity across the divide. So for us, that has been really something that we've also learned in terms of how women have ordinarily come up with solutions. And we've seen this really coming out to the fore, that they will not sit back, but they will bring together whatever resources they might have, whatever innovations they might have. We have communities where there's no water easily available, and we've seen how that burden, where those gender roles where women are the ones responsible for water, and with this whole COVID messaging on use of water, washing hands, but we've seen some very exciting innovations of women coming together and putting the taps and really bringing together their resources as much as possible. But we've also seen that COVID has really shown how inequality can kill, particularly in low income communities. And the whole mantra of building back better, I think we should really be talking about building back differently and addressing some of the structural inequalities, the gender inequalities, really now when we look at gender roles within households. So we need to start talking about the burden of care that most women face. And as we are addressing these issues, really bringing out to the fore into the public space, and then really getting governments and the respective service providers to actually start recognizing and rewarding care work, for example. So I think there's so many things that we really have seen in terms of making sure that as this recovery and as solutions are coming up, they are really breaking down some of the structural issues. We know, for example, there's a lot of economic empowerment initiatives, but we've seen that some of these initiatives train women, train different communities, and sometimes they are not inclusive, even for gender non-conforming identities, for example. So at the end of the day, we have very skilled, very knowledgeable, but they are really frustrated because they are discriminated against, or they are getting very piecemeal solutions which are not enabling them to really tackle some of the structural inequalities, or they still remain in the margins of the bigger transformative projects that can really make a change. I think we've also seen a lot of the women communities that we work with also finding their voice, even in this space. And I think one of the things that we have seen is being able to facilitate their meaningful engagement in different platforms. So this is something that we've really seen, but we still want to push that we have women at the table when issues around social protection are being discussed, issues around macroeconomics, around really coming up with solutions, that women are there and they are part of the solutions, and they are also enabled to have a voice and not just remain at the micro level. But yeah.
Thank you, Memory. And it's an extremely good point that to challenge this notion that we want to build back. It's not to build back, as you say, it's to build something different. And that point around this moment providing a catalyst for that systemic change that you've highlighted. Is that something that you can see resonating with you as well, Beena? And how do you see that playing out in your context?
Yeah, I think a lot of valid points raised by Memory. Very similar situation in India as well. Yeah, see, one of the things that is happening even during COVID is that you would think that since COVID is a pandemic, everybody is suffering from it, that there will not be violence, But then we are seeing the same, or if not more violence. To an extent where you see that, they are actually saying that Dalits are carriers of COVID. So as an excuse to further, exclude. So what we are doing is some of the, I would look at some of the strategies that we're using. One is to use technology, that using technology to actually track communities who have been affected by COVID. So to see that who are the communities that are left behind due to this COVID, no? What are the issues that they're facing? Are they facing discrimination? Are they facing, have they not got their food supplies? There are certain new schemes announced by the government, whether it be cash transfers, whether it be food, whether it be grains. Are they getting that? What about their sanitation facilities? Are they being provided sanitation by the government? So we're using technology through an app to track these communities and ensure that they're able to access the scheme. So on one hand, we're tracking, we're building a data. On the other hand, we're telling the government, both the local, subnational, as well as the national government, that, hey, there are these N number of Dalits or people from the indigenous communities who are left out of this. So we're trying to connect the two. In India, one thing is that there are very good schemes, there are very good laws, there are very good policies. Where the issue is in implementation of the policies. So we're trying to bridge that gap between the communities actually accessing resources, whether it be public entitlements, whether it be, ensuring that they're able to get money into their bank accounts of whatever new schemes that the government has announced. We are definitely, one of the challenges that we're seeing is livelihood. A lot of them have lost their livelihood. We're not talking about the middle class, but we're talking about the lower class, where mostly the Dalits come in, the labor class. They've lost their jobs. They're, construction workers, cleaners. Many of them have lost their jobs. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to tell the government that, what are the schemes that are there for livelihood? What are the schemes that are there for employment? Can we ensure that the communities are able to, so we build awareness amongst them, ensuring that women are at the front lines. Most of the time, women are, because she has to care for the family, she's left out. So can we ensure that the women are able to access those livelihood programs? So I think it is all about access at the end of the day. We're also advocating with the government to build in social protection schemes. One of the things that we have seen and what the COVID-19 has exposed is not having social security. So how do we are ensuring that we're trying to see if the government can actually have better mechanisms to ensure social protection for communities who have no savings, who have no land holdings, who have no access to resources other than what they earn on a daily basis. So how can we build in a social protection that includes good health insurance and they can access public sector help?
Very, very clear and very precise, Beena, in terms of recommendations. I heard there, particularly around social protection, universal health, but also interesting your use of technology there, that you're actually able to use technology to really surface where the challenges are most harsh, and how you can really get the support to the people who need it the most. So I think that's a very exciting example. And I'd like to now pass over to Fatou to hear how things are progressing in Gambia, and where do you see opportunities or potential ways forward to try to bring a next step within the context of Gambia?
Thank you very much. I think that is a very important question as far as not only mitigating the environmental crisis and the climate change crisis are concerned, but also other pressing current issues that we're facing. In terms of the environment, particularly us at Cleaner Gambia have been actually engaging in tree planting exercise, because already I mentioned in my initial statement that right now we are facing severe threat of inundation on the 1 meter sea level rise due to climate change. So we have been advised that planting trees, especially coconut and baobab trees, actually help halt erosion. So we've partnered with a local institution or local organization to plant 5,000 coconut trees along the coastal area, because we believe that this is actually going to help at least mitigating the growing threat of climate change. In addition as well, we have been engaging in series of awareness creation, not only at our community level but at national level, because we were planning to organize the Maiden National Youth Conference on Climate Change. Unfortunately, we couldn't have that because of the COVID-19. But what we have been doing is to engage relevant stakeholders like the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change and the British High Commissioner, as well as some other local and grassroots organizations, to see how we can work together to make sure so that we synergize our efforts and our actions to collectively fight this common problem that we have. Because we believe that the more we partner, the more we synergize our efforts, the more we are going to have more impact as far as what we are trying to fight for is concerned, which is the environmental crisis. So that is what we have been doing. In addition as well, we don't have environmental sciences and climate action in our school curriculum, which is actually the sad part. And we all understand that climate change is actually going to affect the children most in the long run. So we have been trying to engage the government to have environmental and climate action in our school curriculum, that is from the basic level, so that when these children are actually growing up, they will get to know more about climate change and how they can be able to individually take action, because we want it to be part of our system, like how we have maths, English, and science, as well as other core subjects that they actually are taught from all levels. So this is what we're trying to do, to make sure that at least if it is incorporated, they will be very conscious about their actions and their attitudes, especially when climate is concerned, and we can be able to make sure that at least we can target or focus more on other set of the community, that is the women farmers, as well as other people that are not actually educated, because in the Gambia, a lot of people are actually not educated. So when we have to talk about issues about climate change at all, which is a bit maybe somehow a bit complex, then we have to actually go down to their level and see how we can be able to communicate very properly or very well, to make sure that they understand what the climate or what environmental sustainability actually entails. So these are some of the few things that we have been doing, that is building partnership, organizing awareness creation activities, planting coconut trees, and also getting more young people engaged, because the sad part was that a lot of young people in the Gambia were really not aware about the environment. So when we started our activities, especially with the tree planting exercises and the workshops that we've been having, we've been able to mobilize a lot of young people who are now getting engaged in the climate action activity. So we are hoping that at least the illegal rosewood harvesting will actually be stopped as soon as also the partnerships that our governments are actually engaging, especially with other countries, should be very, very we should make sure that it's actually not damaging to our environment, and to have more climate adaptation and mitigation activities as far as the sustainability of our environment is concerned.
Thank you, Fatou. And I could see some similarities in what you highlighted in terms of education and awareness raising with some of what Jean-Betrand also highlighted, that it's so important to build in language that is accessible and reaches people in a way that they can understand and they can engage with, because you're right, otherwise we stay in these policy bubbles and it doesn't really change on the ground. So on that same strand, I'm hoping that Josaia, that's also something I imagine you've been looking at. How do you communicate these messages with communities in the Pacific Islands?
In the Pacific Islands. Thank you, Oli. First of all, with climate-induced relocation, this is quite a sensitive issue in the Pacific Islands, as I've mentioned already, with our ties to our land. Through our project with the Kiribati Association of NGOs and supported by Commonwealth Foundation, we have managed to provide that enabling space, an enabling environment for community engagement and dialogue to just reflect their concerns and priorities on climate-induced relocations. Within our work as CSOs in the Pacific, we actually have engagement mechanisms with our government in terms of policy and implementations. And that also goes in Kiribati, where CSOs are part of the implementation plans for all the climate policies in place. But at the regional level, where PIANGO is working, there are regional mechanisms that are in place and are adopted by the various countries and are informed by the various policies of each Pacific Island countries. Namely, this is something that is called, that was our Pacific Island Forum leaders have endorsed the Boy Declaration on regional security. We've recognized that climate change is a major security issue in the Pacific as well. So managing to gather the community voices and amplify it at not only at the national level, but at the regional level. And now we are trying to amplify that at the international fora is something that we are aspiring for PIANGO. Another regional policy or framework that I would like to highlight is that we have a framework for resilient development in the Pacific. This is a framework that integrates climate change adaptation or climate change actions with a disaster risk reduction. And in this framework, it has specific roles. It's a multi-stakeholder. It promotes a multi-stakeholder approach where even communities are also involved. So through this project, we've managed to harness the voices of the community and amplify it through that framework. Apart from that, in terms of other mechanisms that we have, or what are some of our key asks from the Pacific, we would like to ask for resource mobilization, not only to the government, but to the communities themselves for adaptation and their resilience. We know that there are a lot of funding that are available to have a budgetary support to our governments, but also ensure that those funding trickle down to the communities to ensure that they are able to implement their climate adaptation or mitigation plans that are in place. Apart from that, we resonate and we resound the call of our Pacific Island leaders for the Paris Agreement and the fact that we need to reduce our emissions to the 1.5 degrees. That is something that we in the Pacific have been at the forefront with our leaders. So we need to reiterate that, and we also call for solidarity from across the globe, because we are vulnerable due to climate change and their links to disasters. We've seen a high frequency and increase in frequency and intensity of cyclones as well in the Pacific. We are a region which is prone to cyclone as well. So we face all those vulnerabilities, but we are a resilient people. Just to end off, Oli, just to highlight that in the Pacific, they say that communities knows best, and that it incorporates the traditional knowledge that the communities have. They have been adapting or being resilient to various cyclones, to any disasters through eons of ages. So that is something that we would like to bring to the fore, whilst at the same time there are needs to synergize this traditional knowledge with other modern technological knowledge to enhance our resilience. Thank you so much.
Excellent point to end on there, Josaia. How do you combine that traditional knowledge of living in harmony with nature while harnessing the opportunities from technology and combining the two? And I think that's a great lead-in back to Angela, who I know is going to talk about some of the ways that communities are finding solutions within the Amazon. So Angela Menges, back to you.
Ok, Oliver. Na verdade, a gente sabe que tudo que esse sistema capitalista predatório quer é nos convencer de que a floresta é um problema, quando, na verdade, a gente sabe que ela é uma grande solução, né? E o meu pai já falava disso há mais de 30 anos, quando ele falava da valorização da floresta em pé, e já organizava seus companheiros e suas produções de castanha, de borracha, através das cooperativas, né? E a gente sabe do potencial que a Amazônia tem, né, e que é, na verdade, cobiçado aí pela indústria cosmética, indústria farmacêutica, indústria alimentícia, né, por toda essa biodiversidade que vai desde essências, óleos vegetais, fibras, enzimas, né, passando também pelos alimentos com alto poder nutritivo, como a própria castanha, o açaí, o cacau, e ainda o látex, que também é produzido e atende aí a indústria automobilística. Então, a gente tem um conjunto aí de potencialidades conhecidas, mas a ciência, né, os cientistas e pesquisadores nos falam também de um potencial que tem, que ainda não foi identificado, que ainda não foi pesquisado e que talvez nem seja, né? Dada aí a aceleração no desmatamento da Amazônia. No entanto, a gente tem, ao longo de toda a Amazônia, exemplos e modelos de que é possível estabelecer uma outra relação de produção e consumo harmoniosa com essa floresta, né? Nós temos modelos aí inclusivos, onde essas populações que estão lá, elas são protagonistas. Então, a gente entende que isso só dá certo se as populações fizerem parte desse processo também, né? E passa também, por exemplo, por uma grande beleza cênica também, que propicia aí um trabalho muito forte com o turismo, né? Então, é um conjunto de coisas e que já estão sendo trabalhadas aí, que são exemplos e que são modelos em toda a Amazônia, e que fazem, que nos mostram que é possível, sim, e que dá certo, né? Trabalhar isso gerando inclusão, justiça social, né, preservando a floresta e trazendo para a gente esse conceito de bem viver, né? Mas a gente precisa, então, mudar os paradigmas, né, em relação à Amazônia, não ver, por exemplo, ela apenas como uma fonte de matéria-prima, mas fonte de um lugar com riquezas imensas culturais também, que, a partir dos seus modos tradicionais de vida, também conseguem ter essa relação harmoniosa com a floresta e protegê-la. Então, a gente sabe que o que falta, na verdade, talvez seja um impulso, seja um incentivo, principalmente em alta tecnologia, que possa aí descobrir, talvez, novos produtos, mas que possa potencializar também o que já é feito e que traz, de fato, né, essa justiça social que a gente tanto busca e que meu pai também buscava lá atrás. A gente sabe que é possível, a gente só precisa de apoio para isso.
Obrigado, Angela. Muito obrigado. And thank you once more. Very useful overview there of some very practical steps that are being taken that allow people to actually make a living from the rainforest while maintaining the heritage and the natural biodiversity at the same time. An incredibly strong example of how that is possible, that actually you can have both economic and social and environmental systems working together rather than against each other. So this has been an incredibly rich discussion. We've had a snapshot, a taster of the different struggles and the different frontline voices that are facing these challenges in different ways and different dimensions of the same challenge. If you've enjoyed this, we'd love to keep in touch. You can see more on our website, and I'd like to also just announce that we will be launching a new project with many of our partners, including those that you've seen today, which is supported by a new Climate Justice Resilience Fund, which will aim to tell the stories of frontline activists over the coming year. So there'll be more information coming out, and there'll be more stories and more videos that you can follow in the coming months. And we really look forward to keeping in touch. Thank you again to all of our incredible panelists. And I'm sorry we didn't have more time, but this is the beginning of a conversation, and let's keep pushing together to turn it around. Thank you to everyone.